Welcome to the fifth and final session of the Rutgers Graduate School of Education Summer Series for Educators on Excellence and Equity in Remote Learning. Tonight's session focuses on anti-racism in the remote classroom. Racial injustice has been central to the story of this country since its inception. Our deep socioeconomic and racial divides have intersected catastrophically with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has disproportionately impacted communities of color. The ongoing civic uprising triggered by George Floyd's murder has spurred a public conversation on racial justice that is, perhaps, deeper and more widely spread than ever before. In June, the Dean of the Graduate School of Education, Dr. Wanda Blanchette, called upon the GSE, our faculty, staff, students, alumni, partners, and friends to continue to take a stand in their communities to bring an end to the systemic racism and dehumanization that Black and other communities of color face every day. Tonight's session is part of that critical work. The session brings together educators with commitment to and expertise in anti-racist education to share their experiences and ideas on how to engage young people in discussion and study of racism, inequality, and equity amid the particular challenges of remote learning. As you watch, please take part in the YouTube chat where you'll find educators from all over New Jersey and beyond. We'll be taking questions from there, and it's also a good place for you to share your own insights and experiences with each other. If the chat isn't appearing live for you, please just refresh your page. Our moderator tonight is GSE alumna Joy Latara Smith. Dr. Smith is entering her 17th year as an Opportunity Program professional. Since 2003, she's worked with the WellsLink program at Syracuse University, the NJ Seeds program in Newark, and New Jersey's Educational Opportunity Fund. She holds a doctoral degree in Social and Philosophical Foundations of Education from Rutgers, along with an undergraduate and master's degree from Syracuse University's Cultural Foundations of Education program. Her research focuses on the social experiences of Black women in educational spaces. Dr. Smith is an outstanding educator and facilitator of conversations on race and inequality, and I'm thrilled to have her as our moderator this evening. Handing it over to you now, Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin, for that introduction. Welcome to tonight's session. We are in a very, very critical time and space right now. As mentioned, George Floyd's murder catalyzed an entire movement, unlike anything that we've seen realistically since the civil rights movement. And this time it's very different in terms of how young people have really engaged and really worked to seek change in what our policies and what the culture of America, or specifically the United States, looks like at this point. And so what we are looking for blatantly and clearly is an anti-racist movement. If you all have checked Google or social media or anything of that nature right now, we know that this movement, this cause, this thought process has permeated even our professional athletic, the NBA, I apologize. And at this point, the playoffs have now been postponed and or canceled because of this desire for this change that we seek in the United States. And so here we are today to really talk about this on the cusp of the academic year starting. For those of us in higher ed, the year has already started for our K-12 coworkers and counterparts. It's beginning in approximately a week, but we're back to school, we're back to work, engaging and trying to figure out what those next steps are. Because the reality is this, the youth and young people in America are ready and looking for change. And it is our responsibility to make sure that we're using our educational space to do just that, to educate them, to make sure they're getting accurate representations when it comes to history, when it comes to language arts, that they're seeing themselves in the curriculum, that we're being culturally competent, and that we're being culturally responsive and responsible. So we're here today to talk about that. We're here to talk about what anti-racism is. We're here to talk about what racism is. And I want to preface the conversation that we have today because we tend to talk about race or racism from a dichotomy, like from a perspective of just being Black and white. There's far more in the spectrum when we're talking about race and racism and anti-racism. So if your school population or if your community is not Black and white, if it is encompassing of all races, meaning we're talking about Black, brown, indigenous, and other people of color, if your community is representative of people who are first generation in the United States, the terms that we're using, the work that we're looking at will also be applicable to what you're doing. So what we want to start with is putting some of this in context, right? We use terms very loosely when it comes to race, equity, inequality, diversity, and inclusion. We tend to use these words almost as catchphrases, not realizing the marriage between them and not realizing the impact of the words and being knowledgeable about what they mean. So we want to put this in context in terms of what is race, what is racism, and then what is anti-racism. So we want to introduce Dr. Christine Umay-Kopp and her video in particular, because she does an explanation of what this looks like. She's not with us present, but she's done this presentation for us so we can be clear about what those words are. So Dr. Christine Umay-Kopp is a cultural psychologist and a professor of psychology at Santiago Canyon College in Southern California. She's an educator and she focuses on social justice in all of her courses and in her life and well-being. And so I'm going to turn it over so we can look at her video and at her explanations of what racism and anti-racism is specifically. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dr. Christine Umay-Kopp, and I'll be talking about some basic concepts as they relate to doing anti-racism work. Racism is a system whereby some are oppressed and others experience privilege. And we're often taught to think of oppression. However, we're not really encouraged to look at the other side of that coin, privilege. This can be much more difficult to examine. Racism is also shaped by white supremacy, and this is not about blaming or pointing the finger. It is about understanding the historical context within which racism has had to exist within the United States. Racism also exists on an institutional and structural level through things like policies and legislation. Racism exists on individual social levels as well. You can see it manifest this way through things like the expression of stereotypes, prejudices, and microaggressions. And lastly, racism underlies all other isms: classism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, sizeism, just to name a few. Dr. Kendi defines racist as one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inaction, or expressing a racist idea. Many of us are taught to think of being racist as something that's conscious, intentional, and that harbors malicious intent, when truly this is a myth. Like me, you too may have experienced individuals who are very well-intentioned, well-educated perhaps, good-hearted, and yet they too believe in racist ideology and can behave accordingly. Why is this? A lot of our socialization occurs on an unconscious level. Therefore, we can pick up so many beliefs and prejudices without ever realizing it. We learn from media, group affiliations, spiritual institutions, and even our own families. This leads me to the notion of implicit attitudes and biases. These are things that are outside of our awareness. We don't even realize that they're there, but the harm is that they still lay dormant in our memories, and therefore they have the potential to impact our behavior at any given point. We also, however, have explicit attitudes, and these are things that are within our consciousness. We're totally aware that we have them. Psychologists also talk about this notion of dual attitudes, and what this refers to is the fact that implicit and explicit attitudes can coexist, even when they may contradict one another. This is how a person can truly believe that they are not racist, and yet behave in very racist ways, again, without ever realizing it. I'd like to share a story with you about a young woman who was in one of my classes recently. At the time, she was 19 years old, and she also identifies as Latina. I was really perplexed when I didn't see her submitting her written work, when in class she would share some brilliant insights and ideas, especially during difficult dialogues like that on racism. When I touched base with her one-on-one, what I learned is that up until middle school, she felt really confident about her writing ability. But then in high school, she switched to a different institution, one that was primarily white. And it was there that she received both direct and indirect messages from not only her peers, but unfortunately her teachers as well, that she did not have the skills that it took to be a good writer. Why? because she was Latina, because of her skin color. And she learned through this that white voices were the ones that would be listened to, and her voice as a Latina would be perceived to be invalid. Dr. Kendi defines anti-racist as one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. I'd like for us to keep in mind that these actions and efforts can be both big and small, both formal and informal. We can fight for new policies at our educational institutions. We can also make sure to treat other people with dignity and respect. Being present, fully present with another, believing them, listening to their stories, that can also go a long way. And maybe even more importantly, committing to doing the deep work that we're all capable of, that internal work, to help us unveil where our blind spots are. Lastly, I'd like to leave you with one question to think about. Do you have power? If I were to define power as your ability to influence another, my guess is your answer then would be yes. So I encourage you to consider, how will you choose to use your power, particularly as an educator? Thank you for your time.
So now that Dr. Umali Kopp has given us definitions on race, anti-racism, and the experiences of a particular Latina woman who felt like her voice would not be heard because of her racial identity, it brings us, or it begs the question of us as educators. At the end of her presentation, Dr. Umali Kopp says, do you have power? And I want us to take some time to really think about that. We are educators. At the height of this particular movement, we were thinking about and talking about race and racism and anti-racist practices prior to this. But again, we are in literally the fire of it at this point. And so it's not enough for us just to be, reflective and kind of say these things within ourselves. It's time for us to really think about it, be philosophical, but also be the practitioners that we say that we are as educators. And so it begs this question, do you have power? She argues that we do. And so I want us to take some time, some reflection space now to ask the question, if we do have power, in what ways are you exercising that power to ensure that your educational space is an anti-racist one? Now, because racism exists on both a systematic level and on a local level, right? We have to think about what ways can we do this. Some of us, by nature of our positions, have greater, I don't want to say greater power, but we have a different level of power that can be more impactful across a group. So if you are an administrator who's looking at this, or you are one who creates the policies for a particular institution, a school, or even for a school district, in what ways are you implementing or using your power to ensure that racism does not exist in that space? For those of us who are closer to the ground level and working closer with students, in what ways are you ensuring that the culture at your school is not one that is racist? Or it creates, or we're operating in places of implicit bias where microaggressions are happening on a regular basis and students are experiencing them and we're not doing anything about it. So if we can take a few minutes and just kind of put those thoughts into the chat even, what are the ways that we are exercising our power to ensure that we are not creating or replicating racist acts, whether implicit or inconspicuous? What ways are we doing this, right? How are we working to ensure that our spaces are not those that can be called racist, whether intentionally or intentionally? I want to take some time to kind of reflect on that. And if anyone wants to place their thoughts in the chat, you can definitely do that and we can take a look at them now. So I see that we're saying that teachers have the power to guide the students and how they see themselves and how they view themselves. So that's part of what we're looking at. It's about this notion of cultural competence and cultural relevancy, working to make sure that the curriculum shows students in ways that are positive and accurate in what we see. History is a prime example where that happens, where oftentimes we can tell the story of how the United States came to be, and we leave out the experiences of people of color. We leave out the experiences of Black and Brown and Indigenous people. Telling that story accurately, once one of our responders says that teachers have the ability to make sure that they are seen in an accurate fashion. Helping people to learn and connect with each other so that we can create a more racially just society. It's this notion, again, of authenticity and communication. We cannot live in a society, we cannot function in a school culture if we're not engaging in dialogue to make sure that we understand where each other's coming from, understanding cultural practices, and again, making sure that those values are seen, feel safe, the people feel safe when they're coming from different groups, and that they can trust their experience with you in the first place. Okay, we're addressing racist comments and using them as teachable moments, right? So it's not enough to just say, don't do that, but really addressing the fact that these comments have happened, and that how we can make sure that we're teaching people to ensure that those comments don't happen again. And I know that there are a good number of you who are responding in the chat, so please keep doing that, because we want to look at how you are really working to ensure that your spaces are not racist spaces, but you're actually moving towards a more anti-racist culture. That essentially is our goal. And so we have several presenters here this evening who can really speak to this work. Many of them are graduates of this Graduate School of Education. And so what I want to do now is introduce them so we can really get into a dialogue about what does this work look like, and what does it look like from different perspectives? Because again, we all don't play the same role in the school culture, but we all can be equally as impactful. So I want to introduce our speakers for today. We have Dr. Lennox Small. He's a passionate educator who served as a middle and high school teacher and administrator, and currently serves as a district supervisor of humanities and the New Brunswick public school system. He received his doctoral degree from the University of Pennsylvania. We also have Ms. Bailey Verdone, who is an English and humanities teacher with more than 10 years of experience at the Westfield High School in Westfield, New Jersey. She completed her master's in education at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education, and also holds a degree in secondary education and writing from Muhlenberg College. She's written anti-racist curricula, written and facilitated anti-racist professional development sessions and workshops and education sessions, as well as for educators and for students. And she's currently an Rutgers GSE doctoral student. We also have Wright Wilkins, who's a passionate and dedicated educator in her own right. She currently serves as the high school administrator in the greater Seattle area, so she is on the West Coast. Prior to this, she taught secondary social studies for more than 10 years and served as a curriculum consultant for the Virginia Department of Education and the Norfolk Public School System. Sine holds degrees from Rutgers University and the George Washington University. Finally, we have Dr. Anthony Farag, who's a social studies and humanities teacher with more than 15 years of experience at Westfield High School. He works collaboratively with Ms. Verdone. He recently completed his doctoral work at the Rutgers GSE. His dissertation statistically describes the demography of social studies teachers in predominantly white districts and their critical consciousness and critical competencies, as well as their comfort level with critical race theory. He's written anti-racist curricula as well and provides anti-racist professional development. So we have a very interesting and diverse panel at this point who can speak to different areas of the educational experience. So I don't want to take up too much time because I actually want to hear what they have to say. So I'm going to start with the introductory piece. I've given, your bio, and that's great, but we really want to get into what connects you to this work. So if you all, we're going to start with Bailey or Ms. Verdone. If you can tell us a little bit about you, tell us about your school district, and why do you do this work in the first place?
Sure. And first, let me say thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, especially as you were saying, in this time, it's so crucial to talk about these issues. So as you said, Dr. Smith, my name is Bailey Verdone. I've been working at Westfield High School for over 10 years. Westfield High School it's a high-performing New York City suburb school. It's highly competitive. We've got about 2,200 students in the district, and Westfield High School is predominantly white. It's about 85% white. And what brings me to this work specifically is a little bit of a fun fact. So many, many moons ago, I graduated from Westfield High School. Now, I am a biracial woman who grew up in a bicultural household who went to school in this very homogenous school district. And I felt like I was always really looking for conversations about racial discourse in the United States. And when and if they came up, they were They were binary, monoracial, and not necessarily as nuanced as I think some of these conversations need. So I've really followed that in my career, and I'm very grateful to be back there for 12 years now, bringing this work to this district.
Great, thank you so much for giving us that perspective, Ms. Verdone. Dr. Farag, we're coming to you next with the same question. I know that you and Ms. Verdone work collectively in terms of creating this anti-racist curricula and working collectively in humanities at Westfield High School. So what brings you to this work and what's your perspective? Because again, you all work collaboratively, so what brings you to it?
Yeah, as Ms. Verdone was saying, the Westfield High School is a generally homogenous, racially, homogeneously racist district in which white space is where people are comfortable. And I'm Egyptian American, I'm not white. I'm the only teacher of color in my department. And I come from an outsider point of view from the beginning of my career coming into Westfield. I've been there for over 15 years. It's almost like a bird's eye view in a way that has shaped a lot of the things I think about in my pedagogy and teaching. And one of the great things about Westfield is that it allows you to, the administration gives you the liberty to teach a lot of what you want to teach. So that allowed me throughout my entire career to try to teach anti-racist work, to develop more pedagogical techniques, to develop that anti-racist work. And luckily, it allowed me and Bailey to actually develop a specifically anti-racist curriculum called The Global Citizen, in which we formatted it directly for our students, where we envisioned it metaphorically as helping students exit the bubble of Westfield High School into the broader world. And in order to actually do that, we believe that some of the strongest and most powerful social constructs of race, class, gender need to be deconstructed for our students so that they can actually operate in a functional and intellectual and a CAPE empowered manner on the global scale. So one of the chief purposes of our course is to do anti-racist work, but primarily first to deconstruct students' own racial identities, deconstruct United States history and its policies surrounding race and racial discrimination, as well as other oppressive discriminatory practices, et cetera, and then deal with the intersectionality of everything in order to prepare our students and empower our students to exit Westfield as most of them voting members of American society, empowered both politically, economically, and hopefully educationally to be able to enact change to better the entire United States, politics and society and economy and everything. So that's how we kind of formatted the course. And luckily, Westfield gave us the liberty to write the curriculum, develop it, teach it. And I think we've completed our 4th year and we're going into our 5th year teaching the course. And our numbers are skyrocketing. We've doubled the number and they're all seniors. And this coming year, we're gonna have a big chunk of the senior class as our students essentially taking an anti-racist curricular, like an anti-racist class. So that's how we've tried to use our power and our context to try to do some anti-racist work where we are.
Thank you, Dr. Farag. It's interesting, you actually mentioned 2 key things that we need to address, and I'm not saying we're going to get into it completely this evening, but it's something that if we're doing anti-racist work, that we need to focus on, and that is the notion that race and class and gender and sexual orientation, all these elements are inextricably intertwined. And so if we're going to engage this work, we're also going to have to engage from the angles of multiple layers of mutually existing identities when we talk about it. And I'm sure that you do that in your work, which is why you even brought it up in the first place. We have to be mindful that when we talk about, again, race and racism, we have to look at it from the perspective of how it's connected to these other areas, right? It's how the narrative is constructed. And so we have to think about what that means in these conjoining identities. And then the second thing that you mentioned, and I'm not sure that everyone has this, and so I know there's probably some commenting in the chat, I can't see it right now, but I'm sure that there is this notion of agency and freedom that you had with creating the curriculum, because everyone's not that fortunate. And so the fact that you had it says a lot even about the district, even if there's this systematic culture of whiteness that exists in it, there's still this agency that you had to create it. And the fact that you have some of these students who are participating in it says something, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to get back to what that means as well. So I want to go over to our next person, and I don't want to call her by her first name because I want to make sure I'm saying everything correctly for her, Miss Wright Wilkins. Can you talk to us a bit about who you are, what role you play at your school, and what brings you to this work yourself? Why are you connected to this particular work at this time?
Thank you, Joy. And thank you, Dr. Rubin, for having me on this panel. Just a little bit about myself. I'm currently a high school administrator in the greater Seattle area. I work in the most diverse school district in the state of Washington, in the 5th most diverse school district in the entire country. So our schools have over 120 different languages from the scholars that we serve. And that's just my current role, but it's a huge contrast to the role that I had prior to arriving here on the West Coast, where I worked in a very homogenous district, a very homogenous school with 96% African-American scholars. So just those two experiences have given me a different lens of how I think about race, how I interact with race, and how I work to challenge anti-racism or racism in society. And just a little bit about why I'm doing this work. I was a homeless scholar growing up, and school was my safe space. Prior to college, I went to 10 different schools. And the one commonality is that every school that I went to, I had a person that I could connect with that allowed me to use my voice and gave me action and agency to be the person that I am today. And I know that isn't always the case for a lot of our scholars. So why I'm in this work is because I wanted to be who I needed when I was in school. So I wanted to make sure that so when I look at my job and I look at my role, I want to make sure that I'm doing all that I can to practice what I preach, to give voice to the voiceless, to work to create spaces for our scholars, not just our scholars of color, but going back to that intersectionality. So scholars that from free and reduced lunch, scholars that are ELL speaking, that are special ed, so working to create safe spaces and giving the voice to the voiceless. So.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Small, what brings you to this work, and what capacity are you working in again in your school to make sure this anti-racist culture is established where you are?
There you go. Can you hear me now? Okay. Forgot to mute. So currently I am the humanities supervisor for New Brunswick Public Schools. New Brunswick Public Schools is a progressive urban community that I believe is at the forefront of normalizing culturally responsive pedagogy as our practice and norms. So like my colleague before me, I had a very interesting childhood growing up. So from the ages of 7 to 16, I attended 7 different schools in 3 different countries in 3 different states. And my family was not in the military. Well, we were immigrants, that's another story. But I've had an interesting front row view and aspects of race as a student living in these different spaces, and how people perceive race and how people interpret race. New Brunswick has a very large Latino population, but even within the Latino population, there's tremendous diversity. So I've been committed to this work since the moment that I opted not to go to law school as an undergrad and into education. So my initial work as a teacher, I've always challenged the gaps, or what I call the omissions in the curriculum, to provide students with an alternative viewpoint and a different narrative. So I was doing my best to ensure that they would not succumb to the danger of the single story, to quote the words of Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie. And that's when I realized, as mentioned previously, that I had power. It may be only been in the scope of my classroom at the time, but that was my way of exerting my power when I came into the field of education. So now as administrator, the work of anti-racism education continues. So I continue it, but I now have a broader sphere of influence, currently in the area of obviously curriculum and professional development. So I'm constantly trying to create platforms and avenues to push people out of their comfort zones to address these issues.
Thank you. So we have a breadth of experiences here and reasons why we are connected to this work and what we bring to the table in terms of exercising our power. I want to go to Ms. Wright Wilkins for a second, just because you mentioned how diverse your school district is, and the institution or the school that you work at, how diverse it is. I want to talk a little bit about like the things that you do, that your district does, or that you do to build relationships and like rapport with the students, within the community, et cetera. Like, what does that look like? How do you engage topics about race and racism in your space? And then I want to add an additional question a little bit later.
All right, thank you. So just a little bit about what we are working towards. And again, we're a work in progress. We have some work to do because our demographics have shifted drastically over the past couple of years. We were not this diverse. And as a result, our teaching staff isn't as diverse as our population. So we have a lot of work to do with courageous conversations. We had a workshop this morning, professional development for our teachers, where we were talking about race and making sure that whenever we're looking at data, whenever we're looking at discipline, whenever we're looking at these things, we're using our anti-racist lens to really figure out what is the real issue here. Let's dig deep. Let's look at that onion. Let's peel those layers back. So one of the things that we've done this past year is we've created focus groups for our scholars. Prior to COVID, we had about 14 different focus groups at my particular school where we had questions that were developed around sense of belonging, that were developed around teacher-student relationships, that were developed around what we can do as a school to really have our scholars engage more, because our scholars of color, they weren't engaged. They were coming to school, but they weren't engaged, and that's a difference. So we wanted to make sure that we were really getting their voice and having their voice heard. So we have 14 different focus groups. Spoke to about 500 different scholars at this particular school about what we can do, and then COVID hit. So what we've done since then is we've tried to continue those focus groups. So we're having scholar advisories where scholars are working with the administrators and just saying, hey, this is what we see, this is what we can do. We're having our scholars to come to our staff meetings and speak about their experience there. We're having family Zooms and parent Zooms where we're getting input from the community. Hey, what can we do? What are we doing right? What can we do better? Because it's ongoing. We don't have an answer. We're just working to try to figure it out. So those are just some of the things that we are doing.
I actually want to tag Ms. Verdone and Dr. Farag in too, and either one of you can answer this piece. It's the same question. Like, it's not to say what do you do to engage it, because obviously you're doing it through the coursework and the curriculum itself. My question is, given that the fact that, as we mentioned, and we continue to mention that this is COVID, right? And so for so many of us, we are not going to be in a school setting. We're going to do this virtually. So either one of you can answer this. How are you engaging this work virtually when we really kind of need this opportunity? Ideally, right? We need this opportunity to engage them really in person, because sometimes we need to separate students away from their home life to kind of really engage this anti-racist work. So I don't know if Ms. Verdone, if you want to take it, Dr. Farag, you want to take it, but how are you engaging this work virtually?
I'll speak to this quickly, and then Dr. Farag, you can add, but something that we've incorporated into the class is digital engagement. And this we established prior to COVID, and we've been working on and enhancing since we've been virtual. So what we've been doing with our course to establish rapport, to build trust, to continue that engagement, is to utilize some of the strategies that already exist in terms of what does digital engagement look like, and how do you reinforce and foster a relationship over digital spaces. So to be quite frank, we started a class Instagram where even when we were in school, where we were engaging with students over digital space, which was really cool, because not only were we talking and engaging with students from 7 to 3, but this was also happening from 3 until whenever, where students were sending us things that they thought were interesting. We're posting and showing students related classwork material that happens outside of the classroom. So we have a little bit of a foundation that we're going to continue to bolster as we continue to work virtually.
Yeah, just to add, we've gotten a lot of feedback about this from our students. Our class to our students we try to make it not feel like school. Like we don't want it to be disconnected from their lives. And when and last year we were actually able to cultivate those relationships, build that rapport to get to that comfort level. But that's an essential part of the way we try to teach, where it's doesn't feel like school, it's life more empowered in a way. And having that class Instagram, Instagram is more like life than it is like school. And therefore they're kind of able to connect with us, talk to us, see things that interest them, get our take on it, et cetera. And that facilitates those kinds of conversations in essentially really safe spaces for a lot of them, which has been really helpful ever since we've taught the course.
Okay, there's a notion of meeting students where they are, right? Meeting them in their spaces and bringing this work directly to them. And that's one of the things you absolutely can do as if you are in classroom education, that's your dynamic. Dr. Small, I want to kind of throw it to you for a second as well, given the capacity in which you work. Kind of want to talk a little bit about how virtual learning can pose a challenge when you're trying to do anti-racist education. And how do we help teachers and how do we help educators to meet some of those challenges? We have some examples. What's your perspective on it?
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting to hit.
That's okay.
So right before COVID hit, we had a focus group of students, and those students, primarily high school students, and their role was to help us examine the curriculum, where they saw gaps, where they saw challenges, where they saw omissions. So one of the quick examples that we did, we talked about social emotional learning that should be a natural part of communication. But oftentimes the students said it was missing because it was very content specific, many teachers, and they wanted to make sure that social emotional learning was a natural part of connecting with students. The other thing that we did that was a pilot program, we had a book club to kind of expand this work, and we did it obviously virtually throughout the last month of July, and we ended last week. And this was a book club, the book called Stamped by Jason Reynolds and Ibram Kendi. And this book club featured both students and faculty alike, principals, teachers, you name it, specialists. And it was a no holds barred discussion. And part of it wasn't just simply, just discussing the content of the book. And it was obviously based upon the work of anti-racism, but how can we then take this opportunity and then infuse these practices in our curriculum, in our classrooms? The students even said, how can we see this on a consistent basis? So we're utilizing the voices of all stakeholders, and we're letting students know that they're definitely a part of this process as well, and empowering them.
Thank you, Dr. Small. There's a lot that you all talked about this work and how you really are engaged in meeting the students where they are and showing them and putting them inside the work in and of itself. So then I want to actually jump to one of the questions that is in the chat. It's kind of, I'm going to reword it because it's actually come up a couple of times. So I want to make sure that I'm getting everyone's perspective on it. So the question really is, this is very complex work to do, right? It literally is very complicated. It's nuanced. It has all this stuff. Ms. Wright Wilkins, I'm going to start with you again. Where do you start with this first? Like, so how do we, if you're not addressing this already and you don't have a roadmap, how do we start implementing this whole culture of anti-racism and doing the work, whether academically, whether it's reestablishing culture in a space, and particularly like we said, in a virtual space? Where do you start literally? These are all great things that we're doing, but how do we initiate it?
I think the biggest thing, and this is complex, so I think the biggest thing for educators to know is that there is no right answer. There is no one way to start. I think we start with the basics. We start with the listening. We start with the reading. We start with looking at our own biases. What are we doing? Somebody said something earlier about racism being on a continuum. Like, there's no racist and then anti-racist. There's a continuum, and we, even as people of color, we practice racism. So what can we do to examine our own biases? What can we do to figure out how we can make small steps to eventually get to larger boulders, if that makes sense?
Got it. That makes perfect sense. We have another question for Ms. Verdone and Dr. Farag. If you can speak a little bit more about Multicultural Week celebrations, what your sentiments are about those, just from your perspective as anti-racist educators.
How do you want to take this, Ms. Verdone?
Why don't you start? You start this time. I started last time.
Okay, so I mean, me and you, Bailey, we've had conversations about that concept in general, and we formatted our class to be critical, not about multicultural education, to be critical of social structures that oppress people. And you teach and you validate and you do your best to show the reality of the world as best as you possibly can. And we've actually been critical of the idea that, all right, you know, African Americans, you get a month and that's it. That's not good education from our perspective. So we've had discussions about this. We formatted our class to be able to be critical of everything and see where everything kind of fits in. And we've, one of the extended metaphors we use at the beginning of the school year, which enables us to get into that critical mindset, is the allegory of the cave, one of the foundational, you know, pieces of literature in Western education. That could be a use for every kind of level of education. So we talk about that. We talk about how everybody is subject to the shadows on the wall that we all interpret and create our own understandings of our worldview, our realities, and enables us to actually be critical of them when we start thinking about who the power brokers of these shadows on the wall actually are. And that helps us think about everything, and it doesn't make us, it allows us to have more liberty to teach more accurately instead of just simply having a week or a month for a given people that have a whole history of existence on this planet. So that's kind of how we've talked about it. And of course, you know, Bailey, I don't know, we've talked a lot about this before.
Even outside of the humanities course that we teach, I know that this is something you and I both do, is throughout every course of study, and I'm coming from a language arts perspective, you are having critical conversations about culture, about gender, about class, about race, with each unit, with every book, for me in the literature classroom. So it's not just about having one designated week where every culture gets a different day of the week, but this is something that you infuse into your own pedagogy that happens throughout the entire school year.
That's definitely important. It's that notion between that notion really about inclusion or inclusivity, what that looks like. It's not the months, it's not the week, but it's actually infusing all of it into the curriculum, into the culture and structure of a school, so that we don't see one as, you have, like Dr. Farag said, you have a month, you have a week, but it really is a part of the entire experience. We could go on and on about that part in particular by itself, and we have in classroom settings ourselves. I actually want to jump to you, Dr. Small. I have a question for you. It's also shown up in the chat. It also showed up in a question that someone who's watching, I guess, separately sent to me. So I'm kind of doing a few things at one time. But specifically for you, what resources exist to really support educators in their own professional development and practices? And I guess what they're really trying to get at is that, how can we improve and develop strategies on our own, right? So there are professional development series, obviously, that school districts may or may not do. And there are many of us who are doing this academically because we're in programs, whether it's advanced degree programs or whatever you have. But what resources exist to really help educators in all facets to move towards this work and continuously develop?
So that's a loaded question. I have so much to add. But let me just give a quick example that I use with some colleagues and some teachers in a PD we did last week. And it was based on housing. And it's something that we can all, everyone, regardless of race or background, what have you, you can all relate to housing. And what I mean by that is the simple exercise is this, and this is free. You can do this on your own. It's simply to think about where you grew up. The community you grew up is often a product of, obviously, your family and parents, but your community, by and large, they're outliers and exceptions to the rule, but your community is connected to your background, your belief systems, your ethnicity, cultures, et cetera. And then fast forward and think about when you became an adult and you now have the option to choose where you want to live. And ask yourself, why did I move into that community? Whether it's an apartment, a condo, house, et cetera. And most people will give you the standard answer, safe community, good schools, parks, et cetera. But then ask yourself the honest question, what role did race play in my decision to move in a community? Because prior to that, as a child, you didn't have an option, but now you have an option. And if you say, well, I want to live in a diverse community, now, well, let me ask, go a little further. Well, how do you define diversity? So again, we can keep going, keep pushing this issue, because the reason that we've looked at schools, because in order for you to think about not schools, but housing, when you think about where you live, where you currently live, and because where you live has such a strong impact on your ideologies, then the next bridge to the question is how does what your ideologies and where you live, your community, how does that impact your role as a teacher and or an administrator when you go into your school or district on a consistent basis? So what we did is a simple shift, and I have to give my superintendent, Dr. Aubrey Johnson, credit for this, because we embrace some simple norms. It's a simple in words, but challenging in practice. And that was part of our district norm that we practice every single meeting that we have, is that we have to expect and accept non-closure. We have to experience discomfort in this process. And that's supported by district and department initiative. And once we begin to do that, and then we began to start to have some inventory and examine our curriculum. Who are the dominant voices in our curriculum? And what are the stories that our kids are being told based upon our curriculum? And is it culturally relevant? So as you do that, you begin to start to analyze your own practice, your own belief system, and see whether or not there's some clashes and some challenges. Some of the people that I would recommend in terms of doing this work of anti-racism is to look at the work of Pedro Nogueira. I would also say Howard Stevenson, Ken Robinson, who recently passed away, Zaretta Hammond, and I would have to put in there Gloria Ladson-Billings. I think these folks have been and continue to be at the forefront of anti-racism in this work. And that's why I would say start with the simple practice of doing that self-inventory of looking at your journey from where you grew up, where you currently live, and how does that relate to your role as an educator. And for those who are saying, well, I don't see race, well, you and your real estate agent may see race a little differently when you look at your community.
Thank you, Dr. Small. You gave us a great place to start self-inventory, and we need to work it out from there. Housing analogy is actually very, very sound in terms of really looking at this. And we probably never, I know I've never, but never looked at it from that perspective. And when you drill back, you start to see how these pieces literally come together. Ladies and gentlemen, we are sitting at 10 minutes left in our presentation, our conversation. And truthfully speaking, we probably need way more time than this because of the work that each of you have done. But I'm going to go to this last question. And Ms. Wright Wilkins, you already know you're up next. So I'm going to pose this and throw this directly at you. What particular challenges does virtual learning pose for anti-racist education, and how do we meet those challenges this year? And I'm going to add, again, specifically in the climate that we are in right now, because I believe the responses would look very different if this were a year ago, if this was 5 years ago. But given where we are right now, it's going to be critical to the movement of all of this, and the students' understanding will be contingent upon how we approach things. And it's very sensitive. So tell us how you would do that, and then I'm going to skip to the next person.
That is a $1 million question. I think being that we are in a remote setting, the biggest thing about the spring that was to our advantage when George Floyd was murdered and we had those conversations with scholars is that we already had that relationship with our scholars. We already knew who our scholars were. We had been with them for several months prior to COVID. And as a result, we were able to figure out how to navigate that space, because this is a tight space. And I think the challenges of remote learning is the fact that we're starting the school year off and we don't know our scholars. It's hard to build those relationships over the internet. Say I have a 9th grade class, they've never been to high school, they've never met me, they've never done any of this stuff. So trying to figure out how to talk about this complicated topic, how to give them a voice to this complicated topic that grown-ups don't even talk about. It's going to be a challenge. I don't have an answer for you. I think just working to build those relationships. The digital playbook talks about working to build relationships in a remote setting and some techniques that they use for teachers. I think that is key if they're going to how to build those bridges remotely, and then working to dig deeper from there. But again, I don't have an answer. We're new to this, so yeah.
That's very real. We are all new to this, and we may not have answers to it, but there's something about the authenticity that you brought up in terms of, again, establishing those relationships and making this work. Ms. Verdone, Dr. Farag, you all are the in-class folks right now, again, who have been doing this work for a considerable amount of time, having built your own curricula around it. So you literally must have all the answers. So we're looking at you right now to tell us what we are supposed to do. How do we meet these challenges of doing anti-racist education and anti-racist work in school environments when we're not in person? Again, I don't know which one of you wants to take it first. It looks like Bailey's gonna do it. So Bailey, fix us all, come on.
I mean, I'll give you a start, but like Ms. Wright said, the relationship is imperative. You need a foundation of trust, of a safe space, and that doesn't happen in a day or a week or, you know, or even a month or two. Like this, I mean, I feel like to address anti-racism in your classroom in a way that is constructive and meaningful for all of your students, it takes a good amount of time and effort to get there. So for us in our class, I feel like we talk about social constructs for a good semester, and we talk about what are those in general before we get to specifics like race, class, gender. Within our class, I guess what we do is we have to participate also, and we need to show our students that we are also on this journey, and we are also self-critical, and we're also continuing to learn. And I think that's also really important for students to see that this is not just a dispenser of information when we're talking about anti-racism, but it is a continuous journey that everybody's on, even your facilitators, even your educators. Again, the foundation, I think, is most important. What else, Anthony?
Yeah, just to echo that, we do work very, very hard the first semester marking period of the year to establish the concept of social constructs and to teach logical and, you know, logical understanding and be able to have a conversation. We teach them about, you know, fallacies, unsound statements, logical construction of arguments, and to be able to have an actual argument where things don't have to go back to the polarized nature of American society, where we could actually have a discussion together after we build that rapport, after we've shown our own vulnerability to our students, to actually be able to discuss the hardest topics together rationally, logically, adding context, and be able to do that. So, you know, for the first few months of the school year, we talk about constructs, then we teach logic, and then we talk about the fact that white supremacy and racism and racial discrimination is based on a fundamentally unsound premise that people who are not white are genetically inferior, that much of the world believed in 100 years ago. So we've created these social structure based on an unsound premise, a false premise that science has disproven. So we're using every possible methodology we can, logically, scientifically, interdisciplinary, to be able to connect all these dots, for example, to, you know, put us in a position where we can do anti-racist work. It's not the first day. It can't be the first day. It takes a lot of work.
One more quick thing is to really scaffold the way that you're engaging with this information with our students. So a lot of this work that we do with regards to anti-racism is not us speaking to them. It is students first journaling a response to a question, then speaking just to one neighbor, then speaking as a whole class. And we'll do that activity over and over and over again. So as that time goes on, students are being introspective. They're getting to know their peers one at a time before we can really engage in larger conversations. Because again, it starts with the self. So scaffolding that learning activity and teaching strategy is super important for us too.
Got it, thank you. So there's another question really quickly for Ms. Wright Wilkins, and then I'm gonna head to Dr. Small, and then we're gonna be done because we really are at the end of our hour. Ms. Wright Wilkins, you developed a phenomenal list of books from what I'm hearing by grade level, and it really was a compilation that helped us to understand kind of about race and racism. Can you talk about that list and kind of give us a few examples of what texts were on it to kind of give our audience some places to start?
I didn't develop it, but I did send out a list of works that I kind of came across them. I'm an avid reader. I try to read a couple of books a week when I get the time, but specifically looking at books about the Black experience and how that experience has helped to shape America. So one of the books that I'm reading right now is Cast by Isabella Wilkins. I don't want to say her name wrong. But prior to that, she had a great book, Warmth of Other Suns, which essentially chronicled the Great Migration of Black people across the United States. And I think just if you want to get a sense of how systematic racism works and things that you can do to disrupt that system, that is a great text to start with. Stamp, that Dr. Small talked about earlier, Kendi's current book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. There's a boatload, and maybe we could post them on the website for future readers. So.
Thank you so much. That's literally what we want to do. I want to remind everyone there will be a place, there's a portal on our website where different resources that have been mentioned today and other resources will be there for viewers to kind of come to and utilize and read and engage in terms of professional development individually, or to engage your peers and colleagues in that work as well, okay? Dr. Small, you have the last word, sir. If you wanted to leave our audience today with anything related to racism work, as an administrator in your capacity, what's the one thing that you believe that we need to know?
I think very quickly that we had slavery, we had Jim Crow, we had covert racist policies and mindsets. But here we are in 2020, and now I'm in 2020, within the last 2 months, racism is now deemed a public health matter. And so that means that this is not a fad, it's not going away. We're fortunate that in my district, we've done some work prior to COVID-19 and since. Very quickly, we created what's called an anti-bias resource network, questions, I should say, which allows teachers to question themselves before going into a unit. We utilize the culturally responsive pedagogy. I would say you also need to examine your text from grades, from elementary grades to secondary grades. And we've added social justice units within our work. And we have a brand new social justice elective course. And specifically with these courses that we're trying to get our students to be more civically engaged so they can be problem solvers and social entrepreneurs as it pertains to this particular work, beyond simply a textbook. But the other challenge I would say for educators is that, I don't want educators to think that at some point they're going to revert back to what they perceive as normal, because normal as we once experienced has officially come to an end. I think we have to constantly explore where we are on the spectrum. Are you a segregationist? Are you an assimilationist? Or are you an anti-racist? Because once you answer those 3 questions, it'll let you know whether or not you're on the path to addressing this public health dilemma.
Thank you, Dr. Small. So we've talked about a topic that really permeates every area of our lives today. And racism and the anti-racism work that we need to do is literally critical to our success as educators, literally. And if we don't address this, as everyone has indicated head on, if we don't do this directly and right now, we are going to literally create students who are in the communities and moving into the world who are not engaged in a way that's critical to what we need to do at all. Our job when it comes to the process or the culture of schooling in some capacity really is to assist students in being critical thinking, civically engaged people who have different perspectives and learning processes. But we also are responsible for that as well. We have to be, as we've mentioned, critically responsive. We also have to be civically engaged ourselves. We have to be culturally responsive. And now is the time that we need to do this. If this is not work that you have been engaged in prior to this point, now is literally the time to do it. If professional development has not engaged you in this way, now is the time for you to do this literally for yourself. We have the text, we have the experts, we have people who are engaged this way. Now it's part of the work that we do as educators is this notion of authenticity and this notion of being real, being engaged, and being centered. Now's the time to do it. So literally, You've had a lot of information today. This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what anti-racism work looks like. But what we can say is that this is the time, because you're going to be in a virtual space, and because this is so critical, this is our time to start doing this work. So I hope that this conversation not only was good for you for this hour, but that it will catalyze thought processes, events, professional development, other areas of opportunity for growth and development in the area. Rutgers' GSE has been successful in doing this work, but we know that the work is not done. We know that there's no arrival point when it comes to being culturally competent or critically responsive at all. So our goal is to keep the process moving. So we are delighted that our panelists joined us today. We hope that you got something out of the presentation, and we hope that you will continue to do this anti-racist work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, so much for being our moderator this evening. Many thanks to Dr. Christine Umali Kopp, Dr. Lennox Small, Ms. Sine Wright Wilkins, Ms. Bailey Verdone, Dr. Anthony Farag for sharing their expertise. And a special thanks to tonight's planning committee of Ms. Monique Coleman, Ms. Jessica Hunston, Dr. Michelle Macchia, Ms. Christy Perez, Dr. Lennox Small, and Dr. Joy Smith. As our series draws to a close, I'd like to thank my series co-director, Jessica Hunston, who was the logistics guru par excellence. There were so many moving parts to this series, and she handled all of them impeccably. Arjun Nair, Corey Weber, Shannon Chin, and Afshin Shamsi provided outstanding technical and communications support. Our wonderful steering committee, whose names are listed on the series landing page that's at the link below the YouTube window, made this all possible. In the end, over 30 people were involved in the production of this series. And in a time when we're all figuring it out as we go along, their collective creativity, expertise, and compassion made this all possible. And we'd like to thank you, you dedicated educators, for joining us this evening on your own free time this week and previous weeks throughout the series. We at Rutgers GSE wish all of you the best as you move into the academic year. Be well and good night.